Thank you. Welcome along this afternoon's Planning Board meeting for BCP. I'm Councillor Kelsey and it's my job at this moment to chair the meeting. So welcome along to everyone. Welcome to Councillor Farquhar for his very first Planning Board meeting, and I'm sure if he's anything like he was on licensing, it'll be a great asset this afternoon. So welcome along, George. So at this moment, I'll pass over to Democratic Services to read out the housekeeping notices. Joe.
Thank you, Chair. Please note that this meeting of the Planning Committee is being recorded by the Council for live broadcast and will be published on the Council website for a minimum of 6 months. Please could everyone present follow these ground rules. Only speak when invited to by the Chairman. Please use the microphones on your desk when speaking, and please turn off the microphone when you have finished. It is important to turn your microphone off when not speaking so as to enable the smooth broadcast of the video. If accessing the meeting and addressing the committee via Microsoft Teams, please turn on your video function when you are invited to speak. Again, if you are accessing via Teams and would like to speak on an item, please do so by using the raise your hand feature in the bar at the top of the Teams window. For voting on a move, the Chair will call out each committee member's name and will ask the member to respond with a for, against or abstain. This is for the purpose of the video broadcast. For those in the room, please note that if the fire alarm sounds, please exit the building by way of the nearest available signed fire exit route and make your way to the ground floor of the multi-storey car park. Finally, please ensure background noise is kept to a minimum and that mobile phones are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. I will now ask each person to introduce themselves in person. I'm Councillor Kelsey. I represent Eastcliff and Springbourne Ward. Councillor McCormack.
Councillor McCormack, member for Burton and Grange and Vice Chair Planning.
Thank you. Councillor Hilliard.
Paul Hilliard, councillor for Muddyford, Stampit and West Highcliffe.
Councillor Dion.
Yeah, Councillor Brian Dion, Penhill.
Councillor O'Neill.
Councillor Tony O'Neill, Penhill Ward.
Councillor Davies.
Malcolm Davies, representing East Southbourne.
Councillor Davies, when you speak, could you use the microphone on your desk, please? Otherwise, the cameras don't pick you up.
Malcolm Davies, representing East Southbourne and Tapton.
Thank you. Councillor Hall.
Councillor Peter Hall, Town Centre, Christchurch.
Councillor Farquhar.
George Farquhar, I'm proud to represent Boscombe East and Folkestone, and thank you for your warm welcome. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Farquhar. Councillor Marion Le Pedevin, please.
Marion Le Pedevin, councillor for Newtown and Heatherlands in Poole.
Councillor Johnson.
Councillor Toby Johnson, Ward Member for Alderney and Bourne Valley.
Councillor Bartlett.
Councillor Steve Bartlett, Redhill and Northbourne Ward.
Councillor Dunlop.
Councillor Beverley Dunlop, Moordown.
Councillor Stribley.
Anne Stribley, Parkston Ward Councillor.
Councillor Barron.
Councillor Barron, Parkstone Ward Councillor.
And Councillor Bull.
Councillor Simon Bull for Winton East.
We also have a selection of officers with us this afternoon. If I could ask those to introduce themselves, please. Mr. Gould.
Thank you, Chairman. Simon Gould, Development Management Manager.
David Hodges.
Thank you, Chairman. David Hodges, Team Leader, Development Management.
Tom Hubbard.
Tom Hubbard, Senior Planning Officer.
Eleanor Goodsar.
Eleanor Goddessar, Senior Planning Officer.
Lee Smith.
Lee Smith from Highways. I'll be speaking on the Erndale House application if needed.
Thank you. Robert Firth.
Thank you, Chairman. Robert Firth, Senior Solicitor.
And Joe Tyler.
Joe Tyler, Democratic Services Officer and Clerk to the meeting today. Thank you, Chair.
Is there anyone that hasn't been introduced? No, thank you very much. We'll now move on to the agenda items for the meeting. First item on the agenda is apologies. Mr. Tyler, do we have any apologies, please?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we have received apologies from Councillor Norman Decent, and subsequently with item 2 substitute members, we have Councillor Beverley Dunlop joining us today as substitute for Norman Decent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. The third item on the agenda this afternoon is the election of chairman for the 2021-22 year. And I will ask the committee, please, for nominations. Councillor Stribley.
would like to nominate you, Chairman, Councillor David Pleston as Chairman of the Planning Committee.
Thank you, Councillor Stribley. And do you have a seconder for that, please? Councillor O'Neill?
Councillor Tony O'Neill to second that. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any alternative nominations, please? Thanks. There being no further nominations, Mr. Tyler, am I correct in saying that there is no need to go to a vote on that?
That's correct, Chairman.
And I'd like to thank members for having their trust in me for another year for doing this. Moving on, next item is the election of the Vice Chairman for the municipal year. And again, I would, if I may, like to propose that Toby Johnson, Councillor Toby Johnson, has a chance to show his skills now as being Vice Chair for a year. Do I have a seconder for that move, please? Councillor Bartlett, thank you. Do we have any alternative recommendations, please? There being none, again, I will say that welcome to the Vice Chair of the role, Councillor Johnson, and I'm sure you will learn well and do a good job, and I hope you'll be an inspiration. Thank you very much indeed. So moving on, members, declarations of interest. Is there any committee member that has any declarations of interest for this afternoon's agenda, please? There being no indication, I'll take that as none. Moving on then, confirmation of minutes. Do the committee agree to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 22nd of April 2021 as an accurate account? Again, there being no notice, I will take that as so. Thank you very much again. And the protocol for public statements and planning. I will ask the committee to consider and agree to the use of the attached protocol for public statements. The protocol is intended to be an interim measure that takes account of ongoing limitations resulting in the COVID pandemic. It will remain in force until a revised protocol is adopted. Are there any comments regarding this, please? We are all happy to agree to those. Yep. Thank you very much, members. Much appreciated. Public issues. Explain that the officers present will be presentation in each individual application. I will refer to Democratic Services Officer to read out any written statements before we hear from any ward councillors who wish to speak. So moving on, we will go straight to the first item on the agenda this afternoon, which is item 9A, which is Arndale House, 243 High Street North and 1 to 17 Kingland Road, Poole. Could I please ask Eleanor to share her screen with us and go through the presentation, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, members. I'll just share. Just bear with me. Can you see that now?
We can, thank you, Eleanor. Brilliant.
Okay, right. Well, the application before you is Arndale House. It's also referred to as Kingland House, and this is the applicants submitted the drawings which have got Kingland House on them, just to clarify. The applicant 8 residential apartments and also 9 commercial units, which would have a A1, A3 or B1A use, which is retail, restaurants and cafe or office use. Just to give you a context, the application is in the north part of the town centre. And you can see, scrolled in a bit more, Dolphin Centre is to the left of the screen. We've got the lighthouse. And then just to give you some policy context, as I said, it's in the town centre. It's in the north of the town centre, which is referred to in the Poole local plan as Town Centre North. This area is also an area which has been identified as an area to put tall buildings. The application site is allocated. It's allocated for a mixed use of up to 150 homes with a commercial part which would enable an enhancement of Kingland Road. It is a highly sustainable location, town centre uses and public transport. And due to the shortfall in the housing delivery test, the balance is tilted towards favourable sustainable development. Just to give you some context in terms of photos, the photo on the top is showing the view along Klingland Road. I'll just use my mouse to show you. Church is here, which is on the southern side of the site, and then it extends across Kingland Road. We've got the lighthouse that you can see on the lower photo. And then some more photos showing the view from the George roundabout on the top right. And then on the bottom right, we've got the view looking along Kingland Road. And then we've also got some a photo of some of the uses. So you can see in the front of the shot, you've got a professional use, and then there's some vacant uses. NatWest used to be in the building, so part of it's vacant, and then of course you've got the church use as existing uses. Turning to design, these are the elevations looking, the top one is looking along Kingland Road, and the bottom one is the rear, which is facing onto Selden Lane. A small site plan to the right, which shows you where the tallest part of the building would be, and that fronts onto the George Hotel. And having this tower element was an important part of designing, like negotiating the design, to have it fronting onto George Roundabout, which is it's an important entry point into the town centre for visitors. And then along Kingland Road, it steps down so that it relates better with existing buildings associated with the Dolphin Centre and the lighthouse. And then looking to, it steps down again where the church will be, or it is it currently, and that is part of a phase 2 part of the proposal. Again, we've got the other elevations. The left side is showing the view from George Roundabout, High Street North, and then you've also got the building stepping down to the south towards the lighthouse on the right hand side, and then just showing you, I think that's the first floor, and how it extends across the site. In terms of heritage assets, the closest heritage asset is the George Hotel. It's locally, and it lies to the north of the application site. It's accepted that the proposal would result in some enclosure for the George Roundabout, but it would still have an open site onto the George Hotel. It still have an open side on the George Roundabout with its landscaping and open setting. And although it's accepted that there would be some harm, it is would be less than substantial, and the public benefit of providing the 128 dwellings on this site plus the mixed use is considered to be a public benefit which would outweigh the enclosure harm, less than substantial harm to the George Hotel. Turning to the application itself, this is the phase 1 and phase 2 ground floor plan. There are 9 retail units proposed. As I said before, it would propose to be shops, restaurants and cafe or business. And then because they're in the Class C of the use classes order, uses would fit comfortably into these retail units, being in one of the most, well, a highly sustainable location, town centre first location. In terms of the phasing, the existing church is proposed to remain on the site initially, and then so the northern part of the site would be developed, and that's just to show you what the phasing would look like compared to the final stage of the application of the development. In terms of, just going back to the units, they being the nature of being restaurant, cafe, shop uses, they may have some with the houses, the flats above. And in terms of conditions, just to help control any potential issues with the relationship between the two types of uses, I've suggested having a noise details to be submitted, fume extraction to be submitted, and also a restriction on the hours is also proposed. Moving on to amenity and privacy of neighbours, the closest residential property is the Voyager House, which is a former office which was changed into residential flats. And then they have adequate separation between that building and the proposal to not materially harm their privacy. The commercial buildings you can see on the map on the plan. There's a commercial property which has facing windows towards the application site with a separation distance of 17 metres. I understand that that building is actually currently a commercial building. If it were to come forward as a residential in the future, that would be there's adequate separation. There is some potential harm towards outlook for that other windows in the development, and as like I say, it is currently a business use. Turning to in terms of parking access and waste collection, the application, we've had a lot of negotiation with our Highways Authority to get a scheme which provides servicing to the rear of the retail units. It is in the town centre, and with the current BCP parking SPD, they could have zero parking, but the application was submitted prior to that SPD, and so the applicants decided that they'd like to keep some of this parking in the site, and also provide disabled parking and then parking for the retail units as well. In terms of access, that has been negotiated, so we've now got a acceptable access arrangement, and we've got adequate cycle store on the site as well. Waste collection, there's an issue in terms of bins coming onto the site because of not having enough room to provide an emergency escape in terms of the waste if it's required. So to overcome this issue, suggesting that a private collector would come into the site and deal with waste for the residents and for the retail units. Just to talk about contributions, the standard contributions are being Southland SAM and Poole Harbour SAM. We're also seeking a contribution towards medical facilities, education. There's Highways have requested it as a agreement in terms of a car club and travel plan. In terms of affordable housing, the site was assessed on a intermediary application for 145 units, and unfortunately that's come out as unviable, so we won't be seeking any affordable housing contributions. So therefore the planning application is recommended for approval subject to conditions and a section 106. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Much appreciated. Mr. Tyler, do we have any objection or support, please?
Thank you, Chair. We have received an objection to the application and one statement in support that has come from Stuart Black of Summix Capital, sent in by Henry Courtier of Pegasus Group. The statement is as follows. Good afternoon. I am Stuart Black, Development Director at Summix Capital. I would like to thank you for allowing me to address the committee via the officer today. Our proposals for the mixed-use redevelopment of land adjacent to the Richmond Gardens car park will see the delivery.
This is the wrong one. We're talking about the Arndale House one, not Richmond Park.
Sorry, Chair, there are no statements in objection or support for this application. I do apologise for the mistake. Thank you.
Absolutely no problem at all, Mr. Dyer. No problem at all. Okay, members, I'll come across to yourselves now. Is there anyone that would like to start the debate off? Councillor Dion, followed by Councillor Hilliard, followed by Councillor Bartlett, please.
Yeah, actually, thank you, Chair. I find this development a bit troublesome because it's 11 stories high. Now, if you go into that area, currently it's about 4 stories is what the current build is. And the next, there is across the roundabout, you do have the Barclays building, which sits at 10 stories high. So I think it's entirely too tall for that area, although I will admit there is a 10-story building set off from the roundabout and significantly away from the road. I'd like to see it much lower, and I would like to also see more parking, but that's another issue. It's got a lots of little potential harms. If you look at the, for argument's sake, as mentioned in the presentation, the slightly potential harm to the George Pub. Well, the George Pub will be totally overshadowed, and that is a fairly nice heritage building that sits across the street from it. Also, there's a slight potential harm to the overlooking the neighboring buildings, and there is no waste collection. So I think in total, all those little erosions of things taken in whole, I think this plan needs to be relooked and rethought, and I probably will not be supporting it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Dion. Councillor Hilliard.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions for the officer. Obviously, either you, Eleanor, or someone in your team has been working on this for 2 or 3 years, and we've seen the scaled back height and number of flats. I was looking at the Dorset Police's initial comments, but there are no subsequent comments. And then similarly, the Lighthouse, their comments. Do you feel the application have addressed the issues? I think mainly about servicing the Lighthouse, and police, I think similarly about access and safety on the roundabout. Thank you.
Eleanor, would you like to come back on that, please?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Brilliant. I'll just go to something I thought of the previous comments. In terms of the height of the building and the massing, I think we need to accept that this area has an evolving character, and something that I've addressed in my report, and that's the reason why we have a tower element which sits around the area where there are higher buildings being developed or in the in the process of being developed, and then it does step down to read more. To be sort of relate more to the existing character. So there's we're sort of trying to address the 2 issues of the evolving character and the existing. And then in terms of the comments for the servicing with the Lighthouse, I think they did send something in for the second round of consultation. The reason that we've got an application where we've got the servicing on site and the waste, it was very important to make sure that we don't have any vehicles sitting on the highway, so that servicing for the Lighthouse can continue as it does at the moment. So again, it's a balance of making sure that the vehicles are on the site and not on the highway.
Thank you for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Bartlett, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 3 points. The first one relates to the bin collections, and I know that the provision is only half of what's required. So I guess that means that there will be double the bin collections to ensure that there are always sufficient bins on the site. But it does seem quite extraordinary that there's not enough bins to meet the requirement. The parking issue, and I agree with Councillor Dion exactly, but unfortunately we're now constrained with this new SPD, which basically says you don't need parking in town centres, which is I find personally quite extraordinary. But equally, I see on some of the comments online that there's even a complaint that there's too much parking because the SPD is now in existence, which is strange. But the point I wish to make about the parking is if there is no requirement actually under the SPD, why is there a requirement for the two car club contributions? I just don't understand why it's a requirement when there's no requirement for parking there. And the third issue relates to affordable housing. I find it absolutely mind-blowing that a development with a gross development value of somewhere in the order of multiple tens of millions of pounds does not generate any affordable housing whatsoever. Indeed, this is only a requirement for 10% in the town centre in Poole, but we're not getting even 1%. And I find it quite extraordinary. I do understand the reasons for it, though. And I've been looking into the background of this, and I'm very pleased to see that under the supplementary item that was published yesterday, that there is now an overage clause in this that will be applied on this under condition, which I think is essential because things could change and that would upset or could very easily alter the viability assessment that's currently been applied. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bartlett. Mr. Gould, did you want to come back on some of those points? Because I think you're probably in the right position to talk about.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, members. Just picking up on Councillor Bartlett's last point there around affordable housing. He alluded to the fact that in the addendum that was published yesterday, there is now provision for an overage clause to be put into the Section 106 agreement if the application is approved. That hopefully will give members more comfort that there is the potential for a further viability review, because obviously viability is a moving beast, as it were. So it never sits still. So it's possible that in 2 or 3 years' time, if approved and if the applicant doesn't decide to implement the condition, the approval until 2 or 3 years' time, viability could be a different picture. So I think the inclusion of the overage is a good thing in this instance. Councillor Bartlett raised the point about parking. I think there was a comment about the fact, obviously, in accordance with our new parking SPD, the policy compliant figure is 0 due to the highly sustainable location, but there is the provision of some parking. And I think Eleanor's report sets out why there is some parking. I believe there was a desire from members as well for there to be an element of parking. There was also a comment about the car club. I think that whilst we do have a parking SPD that puts a compliant figure of 0 parking, invariably, some people will from time to time, even if they live in a highly sustainable location, want to use a car, and hence why the car club is a nice option for them. Bin provision, Councillor Bartlett made the point that there's roughly 50% provision. It's not unusual in town centre locations to not be able to meet the council's requirements. Obviously, what we do in those situations is we add conditions that the development would need to utilise private refuse collection, which is not uncommon with blocks of flats. There'll be a management regime set up in that, and it will be part of the annual maintenance fees that you pay as a resident there that will cover the provision of private refuse collection. And obviously with a private contractor, they'll be able to negotiate their own contract around frequency of collections, etc., etc. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gould. Oh, do we have Lee Smith available, please? I would ask Lee to come in. Lee's the highways person, and I'd like him to just talk to us about the car club scheme, if he could, please.
Yes, members. Just on the point about car clubs, the adopted parking standards SPD does state that for developments that are of more than 50 units, we will seek either car club provision or contribution towards car clubs. And I think in particular in a sustainable location where a development is providing parking, bearing in mind that the SPD encourages 0 parking, we'd probably even more encourage car clubs in those developments, because although car parking is provided, we want to do our best to encourage future occupiers to not use the car and not have car ownership. So that's partly why the car clubs have been secured, but also there is that more than 50 unit requirement in the SPD for developments such as this to contribute towards car clubs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Coming back on Councillor Bartlett's other point with regards to the waste and the lack of bins, please.
Yes, there is a shortfall in terms of the waste, the number of bins, but that's why we're proposing well, the applicant has suggested a private contractor who'll be able to provide the appropriate vehicles to be able to actually access the site and get up close to the bins, and also have maybe more than the rota in terms of bin collection that the local authority does. I just thought of something. Sorry. It'll come back to me if it's important. Thank you.
Not a problem. Thank you, Eleanor. Councillor Stribley, please.
Thank you, Chairman. There are a number of points I'd like to raise about this one. This is a site identified for up to 150 homes. We have a shortfall in Poole across the conurbation, and we are looking at potentially breaching a green belt to put in several thousand homes because we desperately need to fulfill our numbered requirements. So I'm a bit perturbed that we're only looking at 128 homes, was it? And we could have up to 150 here. In the design, I don't particularly like the flat roofed element behind the tower, and I would have thought that could well be staggered down and put in quite a few more homes on the frontage. I, like others, am not happy with the requirement for zero or very little parking, because whilst people don't want to necessarily use their cars every day, many people will still want a car to use occasionally at weekends or in evenings to visit family and friends, whatever else they might be doing. And if you have a car club with one or two vehicles, you can have 100 and odd people bidding for it every Friday or Saturday night, no doubt. So I can see problems coming there. This has been compared with the Barclays building opposite on the diagonal corner across. That has been there a number of years, and it did raise a huge furore when it was built. Gosh, over 40 years ago, probably best part of 50 years ago now. But because the whole area of Poole Town Centre was originally mud and marshland and water, part of the Barclays building is actually already subsided about 3 centimetres. So I'm hoping whatever is going here has very sound foundations. And I'm a bit surprised that there isn't provision for underground parking. Or and we have, of course, across the frontage, retail or office units. Now, they will need to be serviced from time to time, and plainly you won't want delivery vehicles parking on the George roundabout and in frontage of Kingdon Road to deliver. So they will need to go in off Seldown Lane at the rear entrance. And like others concerned with the waste disposal, I don't think in all my years on planning I've ever looked at an application which had less waste provision than was required as a matter of course by the development. Normally there's more. I'd almost rather lose one parking space and provide it. There is a vehicular access in and round and out. And if the provision is so poor that the council can't deliver the service, then quite frankly, I don't think as a planning committee we should be contemplating approving it at all, to be honest. And I'm really quite concerned about that. And also the lack of affordable housing. I know here now we've got an overage clause. I hope that might be effective. but we know why suddenly everything is looked at and all sorts of figures are put in, and no, it couldn't possibly sustain even one apartment, affordable apartment. Building cost probably be about 80 or 90,000 pounds in a however many million, multi-million pound development. We don't believe it. And it's the same reason why across the board on bigger sites we're getting applications for 14 flats, because 15 triggers the requirement for an affordable contribution. And developers simply don't like putting that in. But we have a duty, I think, even as planning members, while looking at what's in front of us. I don't think we should be approving anything substandard, and certainly the waste provision and collection need to be totally substandard, and I couldn't vote for it on that issue alone. Sorry, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Stribby. I think we have to remember that there is a condition for the waste collection to be implemented in conjunction with the LPA.
But Chairman, sorry if I can come back, that was the point I was going to make. When we pay our domestic council tax bill, that covers waste collection. Are these apartments going to have that element taken off there?
Councillor Stribbley, you know as well as I do, I don't have children, but I still pay for children's education as part of my council tax. I don't think we can use that argument. We can't use that argument, Councillor Stribbley. Come on.
Well, okay, but it resonates with me. These people are going to be asked to pay twice. So I would think 3 times before I bought an apartment there.
That's the good thing, that we're all adults and we all have that ability to choose where we live at the end of the day. If we want an apartment there, we'll buy one. If we didn't, we wouldn't.
That's true, Chairman. Thank you.
Moving on to your points about the greenbelt, I don't think we can rush to cram every available house into a development just to avoid building in the greenbelt. I think in this case here, the fact that they've reduced the amount is probably a benefit to the future residents that will live there, because it means the properties will probably be bigger than they would have been had we tried to cram in more than 150 at that time. So I think, no, we can't just build everything in the town centres. We do have to look at the greenbelt. Hopefully we'll never build on the greenbelt. That's my wish, that we won't ever have to, but we do have to be mindful of future residents' ability to enjoy their properties as well. Eleanor, is there anything else that you would like to come back on, please?
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points. In terms of the number of flats, that's a sort of a starting point really in terms of the allocated site. We need to consider all issues on the site, and so that's why we've got down to 128 units, which is a balance of other issues in terms of parking, amenity, waste, and all sorts. Just briefly going back to bin collection, the condition which is suggested is pre-commencement. So it would be something that we would have to deal with prior to the commencement of the development. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Councillor O'Neill, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I've got 3 questions and perhaps reserve the right to come back and ask further a bit later on. Under the pool planning policy, the local plan, section PP 27, it refers to buildings providing satisfactory external and internal amenity space. I'd appreciate it if the officer could explain what space is available. I'd also ask, given the height of the building, which is significant, and I may come back to that later, what research has been done on shading and the effect on sunlight and daylight? And lastly, of the apartments, do all of the apartments, and I know it's not accepted in planning policy at the moment, meet the national space standards, or how many are sub that standard? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Neill. Eleanor?
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the space standards, yes, they do they do comply with that. They all are. I couldn't give you the figures off the top of my head, but yes, they do address that. External and internal amenity, they've got most of them have got balconies, which would provide some sort of external amenity. We also have the being in a town centre close to the pool park. So there are, facilities within that area which would also, be on offer for residents. And sorry, you'll have to remind me of your first question.
There were three questions. Amenity space, research done on shading, effect on sunlight, daylight, and the national space standards, two of which you've answered. Thank you.
In terms of shading, there is some information in the design and access statement, which is online. Maybe Simon, if you could possibly assist on that question.
Mr. Gould.
Thank you, Chairman. As Ellen has just said, there's information in the design and access statement on shading. Invariably, in a relatively tight sort of town centre location, you are going to get an element of shading, on buildings, and that will be an existing scenario in and around this site. Obviously, in Eleanor's presentation, most of the buildings that surround this site are in commercial use, such as the George's Hotel pub. There's some office blocks. Those are the buildings that are primarily to the north, which would obviously be the worst case scenario in terms of throwing a shadow. A number of other buildings, such as the lighthouse, and then opposite, obviously we've got the, as I know, the Arndale Shopping Centre. We've got reasonable good distances to those and more southerly positions. So I would suggest to members that the main shadows will obviously be thrown to the north. Most of those buildings are in a commercial use. There is obviously one residential building that was referred to in Eleanor's presentation, which is a previously converted block of office flats, and I think it was annotated at being about 34 metres away from this proposed building. That's a good separation distance, but again, that building isn't to the north, so I believe it's probably more to the east. So whilst there would be an element of shadow thrown towards that building, obviously that would be in the latter part of the day. And again, given the tightly knit sort of town centre location, it wouldn't be unusual to have buildings throwing shadows towards each other, but it would only be for a shorter period of the day. It wouldn't be sustained, obviously, throughout the day. And if you've ever familiarised yourself with the BRE guidance around daylight sunlight, it's very generous towards development. You have to have a really bad situation for there to be harm that would be found that we could sustain on an appeal. So if you've got a building that might be shadowed for a short period of the day, the rest of the day when it isn't, that would weigh in favour of forming a view that the relationship is acceptable. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gore.
If I may question just one aspect, Chairman. And I just felt the answer rather avoided the question on amenity space, suggesting that there are spaces nearby. If we assume, not unreasonable, that we're encouraging the elder population, the town centres, and perhaps releasing larger houses, I would have thought that amenity space, which gives a sense of community, should be available within the immediate vicinity, and I don't feel that was answered. I think it was avoided. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Neill. Councillor Pedderman, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions and then I want to make some comments. The questions are actually quite basic questions. One is the footprint of the proposed development. How does it compare with the footprint of the existing building, particularly in frontage? Is it on the same, the fronts of the commercial premises, will they be at the same point as the current commercial premises, or is there a difference? And also around the back, whether the space at the back is similar. The other one is about the vehicle access and the business with the clash with the bus stop there now. I couldn't quite work where cars were going to come into the car parking area, but perhaps that's me. Failure to look properly.
Eleanor, could you answer those, please?
Yep, that's fine. I will go back to Councillor O'Neill in terms of the external and internal amenity. I think given it's a town centre location, we do need to accept that, they're not going to have a garden It is providing a balcony, and they would be using the services which are available to them, and that would be a decision of the future occupiers in terms of whether they that's a balance for them. In terms of the footprint, I'll just switch the slide if you can bear with me. Hang on. I'll use my mouse to show you, Councillor Papadon. If I can, here we go. In terms of the frontage along Kingland Road, it's similar to what's already there in terms of the retail units. And then in terms of the building at the back, I've just shown, it's very rough, but it's kind of along this sort of line that the proposal would be sitting. And in fact, if I go back to the that's a better view of the roof plan. So you've got a better view of the actual footprint in terms of the proposed. I'm sorry, but I don't have the existing on the slides here, but that does give you an idea of what is proposed on the site. And in terms of vehicle access, would Lee might be able to assist on that question?
Yep, Mr. Evans. Sorry, Mr. Smith.
The access at the moment into the site, maybe Eleanor can point to show where the vehicle access is proposed to this site with a cursor. That might help to Councillor Papadon. So that's the proposed access. The existing access isn't actually much further away from that. It's just slightly further down Seldown Road. So at the moment, it would be effectively the bus stop post, which would be in the proximity of that proposed access. It would only be moving that just a few metres further down Seldown Road effectively. So it's not a major moving of a bus stop to another street. It's just moving it a few metres so that it doesn't clash with the proposed access.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Councillor Pedman.
Thank you for that. My comments are really related to the questions. One is the parking. I almost feel that given that there doesn't need to be any parking except, I've assumed, disabled spaces, to have something like round about half the number of spaces for flats is probably the worst of all worlds, because as has been said by many of the members already, lots of the residents will want cars. So there's going to be, I don't know, battles royal over who gets them. First come, first served, obviously, but there isn't much other parking around the area except paid for multi-storey type car parks. It's not good. If there's no parking at all we're speaking of, if it's only disabled parking, people who move in will know the situation. They will know there is no parking, and they would have to think very, very carefully if they were wanting to have a car, what they would do with it for storage when they're not using it. So, as I say, I think providing a fairly large number, but nowhere near one per flat even, it is almost the worst of both worlds. The other point, and I'm delighted that members have already made this point, because I often make it about this sort of development, and that's the affordable housing issue. I'm finding it difficult to remember an application on this sort of scale and in this sort of situation where we have had any affordable housing at all. Clearly there's something wrong with the legislation, along with the system. It needs addressing, but it's not something we can do as a local planning authority or a local council. It needs I presume government action, but it does seem to me that any developer, and I'm probably going to be accused of being disrespectful at the very least on this, seems to be able to wriggle out of any responsibility for affordable housing and twist the value around his little finger. That is an exaggeration, and I apologise if I am upsetting people, but that's what it feels like. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pedwin. Councillor Farquhar, please.
Thank you, Chair, and congratulations on your re-election if I haven't done so already. I've got a question and an observation. In fact, I've got two questions. The first question is that there's been reference to the Barclays building on the opposite side of the the roundabout. That's quite a striking building. It certainly dominates the landscape, and it's probably well that it is designed in that way. It is served at the backside of that by an equally large and imposing car park for the staffing. My question is that I see that this proposal has been reduced to 11 stories. Has there been a survey taken on what size the buildings are in that immediate area? And I don't know what the immediate area would be, whether it be 100 yards, 200 yards, 500 yards, or meters if you prefer. So that's my question on that one. Coming on to the service side of things, I'm glad that we saw the diagram for the increase in the size of the footprint. On one of the first plans, I saw a lot of disabled spaces, and I presume, not being familiar with reading plans in this way, is that they referred to disabled spaces on the actual car park itself. And to Marion's point, or Councillor Lepollivan's point, is my second question is, what provision has been made for disabled parking? What provision has been made for accessible housing, or units, or apartments, or whatever the current terminology is, in this development? And how is that in keeping with the local authorities' treatment of people that have accessibility needs? My next observation also has a question on the backside of it, is that my observation from a number of years ago, I did pass the rear of that premises, whereby the majority of the car parking is actually used by the commercial units, some of which are now empty. Parking, even at that point, was at a premium. So my question in reality is, what consideration is being given to the viability and the sustainability of the commercial units if they don't provide parking for their staff, who may well be leaving late at night, and if they don't provide provision for deliveries? I think there's, as well as service provision there, I think there was also a restaurant at one point. Restaurants have to be supplied day in, day out. And the other points which I had is, so there's a question. And the other points which I had is being covered by other members before me. And I will state that I am incredulous that a developer would come forward without any provision for affordable housing. And to my understanding is that in the eyes of the public, the nature of land banking, people buying separate properties, etc. If there's not affordable housing for residents who want to live, work, and raise families in the particular area, we would be at risk as a local authority of not making a provision for affordable housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Farquhar. Who would like to come back on that? Eleanor?
Yes, I will. Lee has also, I think he can come, he's offered to come back on some of those points as well. In terms of the question about, some provision in terms of disabled access, the proposal would require 20% of the flats would be required to be in accordance with the part M42, which is building regs, in terms of adaptable and accessible homes. So that that's within a condition that we require that. And then Lee, if you can assist on the other questions in terms of the parking disabled access.
Yes, Chair. In terms of disabled parking, there's 8 disabled bays indicated on the plans that members will look at there. There is also a further 6 end parking space, which in the future could be converted to disabled bays. The parking SPD seeks in the range of 5 to 6% between the commercial and the residential. So when you look at 55 parking spaces being on the site, the 8 disabled spaces alone would comply with the SPD, and obviously we've got the further 6 which could be converted as well. So it meets the disabled parking requirements of the parking standards SPD. And there was a comment about commercial servicing as well. In terms of the building height, to be able to drive under the building to get to the rear of those commercial units, it's actually significantly high, the undercroft height. The issue with the refuse collection vehicle, I know a few members have referred to that, is our refuse collection vehicle could actually go under the building. The issue is there is what they call an emergency evacuation height. So effectively, if the back of the truck tipped something in that wasn't supposed to be in, they hit a button on the side of the refuse vehicle and the back loader goes to an extreme height to expel whatever's been put in the vehicle. So there is quite a height under the building. So in terms of servicing the commercial properties, they will be able to drive into the site, and vans and sort of fairly large vehicles to be able to service those commercial properties. So we're confident on that aspect. And if I just touch on the waste collection in terms of this private collection arrangement, that's not an uncommon condition that's put on a number of planning applications. In my remit, I don't necessarily comment on the number of bins, so that's not my area, but in terms of a private refuse collection for the site, it's just purely down to the size of vehicle that would be needed to go into the site. And in terms of refuse collection stopping on the road to collect, what isn't shown on that plan in front of members there is on the opposite side of the road to the site access, next to the lighthouse, there is a coach parking bay, there's electric vehicle charging unit and a taxi rank. So what we wouldn't want from a highway authority point of view is the refuse collection vehicle parking on a cell down there, because of the electric charging point and these other parking things, other vehicles wouldn't be able to pass. So and it would be parked there for some considerable time. So that's why we're trying to get the refuse collection within the site. And it's come down to this issue of it being private refuse collection, because they could use a smaller vehicle, whereas our refuse operators use a particularly large vehicle and they wouldn't enter the site. I hope that clarifies a few points, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Councillor Farquhar.
And the study for the dominance of the buildings in the particular area in comparison to the bank building, which is across the way, how many stories is that? And how does this one compare? Now it's been reduced to 11 stories.
Eleanor?
I don't have the figures in front of me, but in terms of the built form, it is a smaller building, particularly as it's viewed from George Roundabout. I mean, the Barclays will still be the most dominant building in that area. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Farquhar.
It doesn't really answer the question, because for the study of the height, my question was, what is the distance that it's actually taken into consideration for the bulk of the building?
The whole area, as far as I'm aware, is an area for tall buildings to be allowed.
And just for my clarification, please, Chair, what is a tall building? What is the definition of a tall building?
Anything above 3 or 4 stories.
Goodness me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Dunlop, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Comments around parking and sort of close by amenities. I think that we are in danger of failing to understand the concept of urban living. There are seismic changes going on at the moment in the way towns are being redeveloped, the vision of the future. It's been designed around people and not traffic. And I think we need to look at who is the likely market for these sort of properties. You've got 51 one-bedroom properties. These are clearly aimed at single people, professionals who want to be in that live-work environment. They want to be close to the town, close to amenities. This is the group of people that are not buying cars. They're not expecting to own them. They've then got 75 two-bedrooms. Again, these are younger people that are looking for first homes. They don't expect to be owning cars. And I think that we shouldn't perhaps sit here when we live in suburban areas, in family homes with gardens and parking, and try to project our requirements onto the property. Urban living is very different to living in the suburbs. And I think that in terms of parking, you'll find that there are huge groups of people that are actually downsizing away from their cars, and younger people who don't expect to own them. And what, in terms of provision, we really should look at what's absolutely required for anyone who might need to visit that particular building or perhaps, if say, disabled or an emergency vehicle to get through. In terms of those amenities, there are, believe it or not, thousands of people who do not want gardens. They want to be in an urban setting and they want all the facilities that are on the doorstep. So I really don't think that we should get hung up on those issues, notwithstanding that there are some points I think that perhaps still need to be clarified. I really don't have any issues with this particular development at all. I think it's the right development in the right place in an urban setting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dunlop. Councillor Stribley, you'd like to come back?
Thank you, Chairman, but Councillor Dunlop has just answered my question. I hadn't been able to scan back through to see how many 1 and 2 bedroom flats there were, but thank you for that.
Thank you. So, Councillor Barron, did you have your hand up? You didn't. Okay, thank you. Councillor O'Neill again, please.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. It's an interesting one, this, and I'm very conscious of the objectives of the Poole local plan, where it states enhancing the natural setting, the built environment of Poole. And I'll refer to a number of points, if I may. Planning Policy 27 covers a number of areas. For example, Section 1, Part 2 talks about height and scale. I must admit this development does concern me for a number of reasons. If I look in the immediate vicinity, the Esprit building, which was built about 2 years ago now, is 7 stories. Voyager House is 7 stories. Under the Poole plan, anything above 6 stories or 6 stories and above is considered a tall building. A bit further away, there's the Barclays building, which is 9 stories, but that's further away. And to the north and west of the Barclays building is open land awaiting development, and certainly something like this at 11 stories would fit nicely. I don't think it fits in this context. There's also the question, partly answered but partly admitted, about compatibility with the surroundings and the consideration of the impact on sunlight and daylight. I don't feel that, given the mass of this building, that it does provide a satisfactory occupation, particularly when one considers the amenity space or the lack of amenity space. I move on to Section G of the Poole Policy 27, which is really to do with the convenient and practical parking statement. Now, I know this has been overridden to some extent by the SPD, which to my mind raises several questions, but I'm told is going to be reviewed in a year. The trouble is, with a year's time, something like this we've got to live with for 100 years plus. And my concern there is, given the lack of parking with 128 apartments, I must observe that what we're in danger of doing is downtrading our economy in an area where the economy has a great opportunity. If I move on from that, there's been the matter raised about waste. Waste is a function of 2 things, development and occupation. And I must ask, are we overdeveloping a site so much that it can't handle its waste professionally? And the last one has been raised on several occasions, is about affordable housing. If we're actually going to do something about affordable housing, I just find it amazing that something of this scale has not even considered that. I'll say no more than that, but I find it very difficult for all of those reasons to support this. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor O'Neill. Councillor Johnson, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I have to say, like many members here, I was quite torn on some of these things, but at the end of the day, when I'm quite torn on things, I like to revert to the basic black and white policy level of these things. In terms of the parking, I think that Marion is, Councillor Lepedevin is quite right in terms of the fact that it's not a perfect scenario either way, and it is a bit of a bad mix of not enough and perhaps so much that it actually creates a difficulty in and of itself. However, we're a bit bound by the fact that it is currently policy compliant, and not only compliant, but it greatly exceeds the policy. And we have had many discussions within this committee over the past couple of years as to things not meeting the required level. Here we have one where it greatly exceeds the required level. And again, there are issues, but at the very basic level, it does exceed what the developers needed to put in there. And a little more parking than is necessary, I don't think, can ever hurt. I think it's also what we've got to remember, a town centre development. People will not be expecting great levels of amenity space. They will not be expecting to always have a parking space. And if they move into this place, they will be aware, or at least made aware, of the planning scenario. If they then choose to buy a car when they're one of the latest people moving into the place and suddenly find they have no issue, that I would be inclined to think is their issue and not one that we can deal with here. In terms of the affordable housing, as everyone else here has said, I'm utterly dumbfounded that it wouldn't have any affordable housing. But if the independent report has come out saying that it is not viable, then it is not viable as far as we can consider. We are not, or certainly I am not, a professional in that area who can override a professional independent report on something like this. And therefore, I don't think we can consider that particularly, especially with the steps that the officers have taken with the overage clause to ensure that this can be reassessed and isn't just allowed to continue ad nauseam. And in terms of the last couple of things, the bin collection, I was greatly concerned until the officers have said that steps have been taken and they will be taken before construction is started. And quite frankly, private or council, if the bins are collected, then the bins are collected. Unless we have great big piles of rubbish building up on the street, then I see no particular issue. And the last one, in terms of height, it is a town centre location. Yes, it is tall, but as has been said, this is an evolving area. The character is changing. It's not so tall as it will, shadow everything within a mile's radius. It is tall, yes, but again, in terms of the tilted balance and the way that the policy is written, I can't see anything in this that would lead me to not support it, and I will be supporting the application. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with every word that Councillor Johnson has just said. The only thing I would add to that is that the MPPF, of course, does weigh down heavily in favour of sustainable development unless there is some significant harm. And in this event, there isn't significant harm. And we also know about the 5-year housing supply, which is not, so the tilted balance does apply. So from, in terms of planning policy, there are no planning policies that we can use to vote against this particular proposal. I think whether you like it or not, we have to make the decisions against planning policy. And unfortunately, although I've got great reservations, particularly about some of the issues that Councillor Pedevin said, in particular about the conflict between residential parking, commercial parking, those that have, those that haven't, that will undoubtedly cause a lot of conflict. And I still have reservations about the waste collection as well, or there not being enough space to store refuse before it's even collected. But nevertheless, it is there is a condition that is covering it, and officers will put that right, I'm sure, before development will commence. So on the basis that we've probably talked this through significantly now, I would move that this application is granted.
Thank you, Councillor Bartlett. Do I have a seconder for your move, please? Councillor Johnson, you're happy to second. Would you like to speak to that at all?
No, thank you. Just yes, I'm happy to second that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Is there any further speakers? No, I'll just say a few words if I may. It's been a very good debate. I'm really impressed with the quality of the debate again today. It's been very, very good, and a lot of really good points. I mean, Councillor Bartlett's made this point on several occasions with regards to the local viability. It's not done in-house. It does go out. It is totally independent, and there isn't a lot that we can do to argue about it when it comes forward. The officers do try and beat them down on it, but we are where we are with the viability and with the affordable housing. As much as we would all like affordable housing at every single site we do, it's just not possible always to do so. And I think, we do have a very new swing of people living in town centres, And I think we have to work towards that as well. At the end of the day, this is probably in the most sustainable position. It's directly opposite the bus station, and it's probably only a 10, I don't know that particular area very well, but I would think probably no more than 10, 15 minutes to the train station, less than that. So you couldn't really get a much more sustainable location if we tried. And therefore, I will be supporting the move to grant this application. What I'll do, members, is I'll call each name in turn. And if you could indicate for, against or abstention, please. Myself, I will be for. Councillor Johnson. For. Councillor McCormick. For. Councillor Steve Barron. For. And Councillor Steve Bartlett.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Simon Bull.
For.
Councillor Malcolm Davies.
For.
Councillor Beverly Dunlop.
For.
And Councillor Brian Dion.
Against.
Councillor George Farquhar.
Abstain.
Councillor Peter Hall.
For.
Councillor Paul Hilliard.
For.
Councillor Marion Lepedovin.
Reluctantly for.
Councillor Tony O'Neill.
Against.
And Councillor Anne Stribley, please.
Very reluctantly for.
Thank you, members, and I do appreciate your reluctance in this and the abstention. It's a very, very close one. It's very difficult, particularly for people representing those areas. If I could just come to Mr. Tyler, please, for the numbers.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the total number of votes for is 12. The total number of votes against is 2, and there was 1 abstention. So that move has carried, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Eleanor, for your presentation. It was very well done. I appreciate it was your very first one today, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Stribley.
Just a question, something that you said in your final summing up. I know these assessment reports are independent. Who pays for these independent reports? Because I know very well if you go to a consultant and you ask for something, they actually ask you, well, what answer do you want? And they will work for that.
I'll ask Mr. Gould to answer that one.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Gould, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, thank you, Councillor Stribley. So what happens is at the time they submit their planning application, the applicant would have employed a consultant to have written a report. That report is submitted with the planning application. They then pay an additional fee for us to have it independently verified by the District Values Office.
So we do double check.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Members, quick 5-minute comfort break before the next one.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Max, could we stop live stream? Welcome back, members. Thank you for that deferral. Just for information, Councillor Dunlop has left the meeting to attend a family matter this afternoon. We will now move on with the next item on the agenda, and that is for the Richmond Hill car park. And I would ask Mr. Hubbard to present his presentation to us, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, members. I hope you can hear me okay.
We can, thank you, Tom.
Okay, I'm just sharing my presentation. Can you see that okay?
We can, thank you.
Okay, so this application relates to a site at the Richmond Gardens car park in Bournemouth, and the proposal is for the erection of a mixed-use residential development comprising 4 blocks of 211 flats on the north and east side of the existing car park, ranging in height up to 12 stories, including lower ground levels and a flexible shop cafe unit on the ground floor level. There's additional realignment works to the existing service access road from Richmond Gardens, cycle parking, disabled parking, associated refuse and recycling storage, and other public improvement works. So this is the site. It's in Bournemouth Town Centre, Wessex Way, running to the north of the site here. This is Richmond Hill running down towards the central square in Bournemouth there. And then you've got Old Christchurch Road, conservation area, and the main sort of shopping area in Bournemouth here. The site's got a multi-storey car park, which is accessed from the northern side, and there's a shopping centre underneath the car park on the lower levels, which is accessed from Old Christchurch Road. And then there is some land around this car park, mostly covered by trees and vegetation, and that's the area of site to be developed. So this is an aerial view of the site, which mainly shows you the size of the car park. It's a big car park. And you can see there's a sort of belt of trees and vegetation around the site there. This more angled view shows the context with other office and tall buildings on and around Richmond Hill. So you've got the Marshall Point office building, for example, Richmond Gate residential development, the Nationwide building here. Here you've got the older development in the Old Christchurch Road conservation area. So I'll run through some photos around the site. This one is from Richmond Hill, looking at the car park entrance up here on Richmond Gardens. This is a view a bit closer on Richmond Gardens of the existing car park entrance. So the development will sort of begin the other side of that entrance there. You can see the Marshall Point office block on the opposite side of the road here. A couple of views of the site from Richmond Gardens, where the A blocks, A1 and A2, will be located. There's the entrance to the car park over here on the right. So then you've got A1 and then A2 over here. And then get further east on Richmond Gardens, where it narrows. The B block will be located here. There's a number of trees which are quite mature, but they're set in raised beds above the road. And on the bottom here, we've got this existing service road, and then which is to be sort of realigned slightly, but most of the trees on the other side of the road will be retained. This is down into the site on the eastern side. You can see here where the block C will be located. It shows the side of the car park, and there's an existing loading and servicing area for the shopping centre underneath, which is to be retained. This is a more distant view from Old Christchurch Road, opposite Horse. The buildings will be partially visible behind here. And I've got some more visuals later in the presentation to illustrate this. And again, moving a bit further back, the road goes around the corner and the trees start to obscure the view a bit there. This is a view from St Peter's Road, which is to the south of Old Christchurch Road. It's a bit further away, but the tops of the buildings might still be visible here behind this terrace. And this is a view from the southern end of Wimborne Road. So the site is visible on the opposite side of the Wessex Way over here behind these office blocks here. So this is the proposed site plan. So firstly, members should note that there have been 2 developments previously allowed on this site, and in particular a student accommodation proposal which was allowed on appeal at the beginning of last year. That remains an extant consent and does represent a realistic fallback position for the applicant on this site. So I've made quite a few comparisons to that scheme at various points in my report. The second thing to note is in terms of policy, this site has got a specific allocation for residential development in the town centre area action plan. That's policy A19, and it's also in an allocated tall buildings area where taller buildings are considered appropriate, subject to the usual considerations of their design and their context. So we've got 4 separate blocks proposed, you can see here. The student scheme was generally a bit greater in terms of footprint as it spanned over the car park entrance on the western side here. And also on this right hand side, there was a single block which stepped down across the whole of this part of the site. So it's now split into 2 blocks here. And there's a sort of raised courtyard amenity area between the blocks for residents. Just give you a closer look at what's happening on the ground floors of these A blocks. Again, the car park entrance is reduced from 6 lanes down to 4, which is going to be a visual improvement for Richmond Gardens. It's quite a wide entrance, and it allows more trees to be retained on this side of the site compared to the student scheme. Once again, there'll be a commercial use, a small sort of shop or cafe on the ground floor here, as well as other entrance foyers and reception areas, which give a sort of strong active frontage to Richmond Gardens, which is part of the policy requirement. And then you've got all the bins and servicing at the back of the building, sort of tucked away there. There's additional tree planting to the front and a wider pedestrian footway there as well. On the upper levels, we've got a mix of units between sort of studios, 1 beds, 2 beds and 3 bed flats. The lower levels have a walkway access at the rear here, just to sort of give them a bit of increased separation from the car park, but that only affects 1 or 2 levels, and they've still got a dual aspect. All the units meet the national space standards. And then as you go up, again, you can see a mix of different units represented by the different shades of colour on the floor plans. Quite a few of the units have a little terrace or balcony area. Moving over to blocks B and C, underneath these blocks is a large servicing area, mostly taken up by cycle storage and other sort of plant equipment. There is an access in the side for a disabled parking space and other sort of drop-off access, and it's all linked underneath with the courtyard on top, as you can see there. There's a new lift to the car park which provides easy access for residents to the multi-storey car park. There's also a number of roof terraces around the blocks. You can see them here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, about 7 different little roof terraces which add an extra bit of amenity space for occupants. Elevations. This is the front view of blocks A1 and A2, A1 being the larger one on the western side. The elevations are articulated with a sort of box and sort of strong window reveals. There's some mix of cladding and varying heights and materials. The rear and side of these blocks show, again, they're well articulated on all sides because they'll be quite prominent and they'll be visible from the car park as well. The top left elevation here is the front of block B, which is one of the larger blocks. And then on the bottom here, we've got a side view coming down the side of the access road. So it shows that differing sort of levels as you drop down into the site. And again, the way the blocks sort of reduce in height as well to match that. And just finally, some more elevations of block C. So blocks A and B are quite sort of curved in on Richmond Gardens, and then as you come down into sort of the back of blocks B and then block C, they're a bit more angular than those other blocks. This is probably the most useful illustration of the overall scale of the development. I don't know how clear it is on your screens, but there is a dashed outline of the approved student scheme for comparison on this plan here. It shows it was a lot wider on across Richmond Gardens. It spanned over the car park here, so there's a dashed outline going right to the edge of the site. This block A1 is a little bit taller than it was before, but this is justified because it's opposite other tall buildings such as the Marshall Point of this block. Then you've got some good gaps between the buildings, and then block B over here is a bit lower overall than before. You can see that. The scale overall is generally quite similar, and the overall height and mass is probably a little bit less than the student scheme. And then this lower image just shows the rear elevations in the context of the car park. The bottom of these two images show sort of side section. You can see again a dashed outline of the student consent, which was taller, and it stepped all the way down towards Old Christchurch Road. Now it's broken into two blocks. The lower one, block C, is very similar in overall height and location. And this sort of scale of development was considered acceptable by the appeal inspector on the student scheme. So this slide shows some of the architectural detail and materials. The blocks will have mainly a brickwork facade with sort of varying from buff brick to a sort of darker brown brick, and also a sort of red multi-brick for block C. So there's some variation between the blocks, but they're also sort of quite strongly linked as well as a group. Here's some images that help to illustrate the scheme. So here we have the A blocks, which you can see are quite sort of curving and elegant in their form. You've got quite strong window reveals and setback balconies, which sort of add depth to the elevation. There's a view of the building from Richmond Hill. That's the same view as in the first photo I showed you earlier. The pre-span over the car park, as I said before. And then blocks B and C, so that's the front of block B on the right there, and then it goes round the corner where you can see what I was saying, it was a bit more angular, but they do retain the same materiality, so they're all sort of linked in some respect. This is a plan showing the trees on the site that are to be retained or removed. Those that are to be removed are mainly along this northern and eastern side where the buildings are to be located. The tree officer did have some concerns about this, but the tree loss is very similar to that previously approved in the student scheme and the other scheme that was approved in about 10 years ago. The site is also allocated in the town centre area action plan for development, and it'd be very difficult to develop the site without quite a significant tree loss in any case, because they essentially cover all the developable areas of the site. In terms of differences, this scheme removes a pine tree from the front of the car park entrances. It's in a raised planter, and it wasn't possible to keep that if you're changing the car park entrances. But conversely, more trees are to be retained on this side of the site, and there is a large replacement tree for that one as well. So this is the landscaping plan. You can see the replacement tree planting along Richmond Gardens. There's also additional planters and this raised courtyard as well. They're also proposing to improve and soften the appearance of the existing car park with a green wall along the northern side, and also a sort of screening aspect on the other side and some cladding as well. So the car park appearance will be improved. So here's the image of the development from Old Christchurch Road in the Horseshoe Common area. You can see that it steps down from the peak of Block B down to the foreground buildings. You can just about see the rear section of that Block C just above the buildings there. There's been some slight amendments since the CGI was produced, including they've added some more windows to the top of Block C, which is in that little image on the bottom right there. So that won't look quite so blank as it does in that picture there. So the articulation has been improved. This view shows you from the bottom of Wimborne Road, that photo I showed you earlier. This is what the development will look like from here. You basically see it in the same context as other tall buildings in the area from here. And finally, this is an illustration just for comparison of the other consented schemes on the site, because I've referred to them quite a lot. So on the left, you've got the student scheme, that's the Richmond Gardens view, and you can see how it sort of spread all the way around the site with fewer gaps between the buildings. And then on the right is sort of mixed use residential and hotel scheme, which is about 10 years old and didn't get implemented. So I've undertaken an assessment of the impact of the proposals in terms of the height and scale and mass in my report. It's an area that's identified as suitable for tall buildings in the Bournemouth Town Centre AAP, subject to considering the impact on the context, surroundings and views, of course. And in this respect, the proposal, it will alter the townscape in this area, but it's very similar to the consented student scheme in terms of its overall scale and mass. So you're mainly looking at sort of the design differences in that respect. It has to be remembered that the student scheme represents a realistic fallback position for the applicant. In that respect, the scheme provides some additional benefits in terms of we've got the improved car park entrance with 6 lanes down to 4. There are more trees retained in that location on that part of the site. It's a slightly lower density scheme overall, and the residential development, while having similar benefits to the viability of the town centre, it may also provide sort of less transient population than the student scheme. There are a couple of policy conflicts in terms of the lack of provision of additional public parking spaces, which is a sort of requirement built into policy A19. I've tackled this in my report, but ultimately the appeal inspector didn't consider that these 34 spaces were critical to the overall parking strategy in the town centre. The level of tree loss we talked about is also quite high, but again, there's precedent for this in the previous consents. Unfortunately, this scheme has been assessed in terms of its viability for affordable housing, and it came out as unviable to quite a considerable degree, but it will make a substantial contribution towards local housing numbers overall in this sustainable location. There will be a Section 278 agreement for highway works, including cycle paths, pedestrian crossings and other alterations around the site. We got some lighting and CC to improve the safety of the environment, combined with this, it'll provide a more active use and more natural surveillance in an area which is perceived as quite unsafe at the moment. So that's another benefit. The development will essentially be car free, but the new parking standards SPD does support this. It'll improve the poor appearance of the existing car park, and it will make good use of an underutilised site in a town centre location, which is appropriate for urban intensification. So overall, in balancing the issues and taking account of the relevant policies and other material considerations, which include the site history, I have therefore recommended the proposals for approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler, would you like to read out this statement, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the one statement that we have received for this item is in support from Stuart Black of Summits Capital and Henry Courtier of Pegasus Group. And the statement is as follows. I'm Stuart Black, Development Director at Summits Capital. I would like to thank you for allowing me to address the committee via the officer today. Our proposals for the mixed-use redevelopment of land adjacent to the Richmond Gardens car park will see the delivery of 211 new homes to rent, commercial facilities, retail space and public realm improvements. These proposals will help to meet an identified need for new housing in Bournemouth, offering a mix of sizes from young professionals to families by regenerating this underused site. This site is an ideal location for residential development, being located within Bournemouth town centre, benefiting from close proximity to shops, services and employment. Crucially, this means that residents will not require a car to get around, and in line with the adopted parking SPD, this development will be car-free other than provision for disabled parking. The scheme will actively promote sustainable travel by delivering 362 secure cycle spaces in line with council policy, as well as new cycle routes and connections to a range of public transport options and car club for those wishing to travel further afield. We are committed to making this a great place to live for new and existing residents. Our proposals will create a high quality development that improves security in the area through natural surveillance and delivers significant public realm enhancements, including new planting along Richmond Gardens and Dalkeith Steps. Throughout the planning process, we have worked closely with BCP Council officers, statutory consultees and the local community to refine the proposals for the site. We held a consultation with local residents and businesses, held meetings with the Bournemouth Civic Society and Bournemouth Town Centre BID, and presented at BCP Council's inaugural Members Forum, as well as the South West Design Review Panel. As a result of this engagement, our scheme has evolved from its original design to include a reduction of the height of the development by 3 stories, a widening of the footpath and additional tree planting to further improve the public realm. We are grateful to everyone who helped shape our plans for this site and are pleased by the public support there is for our application. If approved, our proposals will represent a multi-million-pound investment into the local economy and support more than 350 jobs through construction and the wider supply chain. In summary, our application will deliver more than 200 new homes on a brownfield site, create new jobs and contribute to the ongoing regeneration of Bournemouth Town Centre. I therefore encourage you to follow your officer's recommendation and resolve to grant planning permission. It's the end of the statement and there are no further statements, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. Over to members and I'll start off with Councillor Anne Stribley, please.
Thank you, Chairman. As with the last application, I'm astounded that there is no contribution to affordable housing, but these properties are not apparently going to be up for sale. They are all to be rented, I understand. Right, well that of course does make things slightly different. Can I be told, A, how many disabled spaces are to be provided for these homes? And what also is the provision likely to be for mobility scooters? Because a lot of elderly people, when they give up their car, they take to a mobility scooter, which allows them to get around and about. And I think if I lived on the top of Richmond Hill, I'm getting to the stage when I might well want one to go down to the square and back up again on frequent occasions. But otherwise, I can't see a problem with this. It's a place for, it's town centre, very urban, a place for high-rise buildings, and looks as though considerable care has been given to the design of these. It certainly looks a better option to me than the previous permissions which have been achieved. So I can't actually see a planning reason to refuse. I don't like the fact that there is no parking, but I would like to know how much disabled parking is likely to be provided and what provision will there be for electric bikes, charging, mobility scooter charging, etc. Because you can't take your mobility scooter up to your flat, or at least I don't think it's usually possible. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Shrewsbury. Mr. Hubbard.
Thank you. In terms of disabled parking, there's a single disabled parking space, which sounds low, but it's actually the minimum requirement from the new parking standards SPD. I think it says 5% of the number of spaces you're providing, or a minimum of 1. So we've got the minimum of 1 there. In terms of mobility scooters, I might have to check in the SPD or default to my highways colleagues, but I don't think there is a requirement for mobility scooters and outside of sort of specific care home or sheltered accommodation type developments.
Thank you, Mr. Hubbard. Councillor Shrewsbury.
Chairman, many elderly people remain independent because of their ability to have a mobility scooter, and many elderly people give up the family home and move into town centre or a district centre apartments because they're easier to manage and maintain. It strikes me that this one is missing an opportunity at that point. You're perching on the top of the hill, 200 odd apartments, new apartments, all for rent, and not one has any ability for somebody with disabilities, if you like, to live there. How many cycle parking spaces have we got, and what about charging facilities for electric bikes, because there are many of those about too.
Mr. Hubbard.
Thank you. I'm just checking the number of cycle spaces. So there's 338 cycle spaces overall, which the new parking SPD has a requirement for a cycle space per bedroom, which is different to the old Bournemouth standards of 1 space per unit. So this is what's taking up the majority of the space in the sort of basement servicing areas. I'll just go back to the floor plan here, and you can see most of this space is all taken up by cycle storage, for example, which reduced the amount of parking on the site as well. So 16 of those have been designed as oversized spaces, which is around 5%, the 5% required by the policy.
I accept that, but is there any charging facility there? Because some of those are likely to be electric bikes and they have to be charged.
I would probably think that would be with each individual flat. They tend to have a storage space or a storage area downstairs, and they tend to plug them in there, from what I believe, not having one.
I think we could add that as a condition, or add it to a condition if necessary.
Yep, that would be good.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Farquhar.
Thank you, Chair. And I would echo Councillor Shrewsbury's disappointment that once again that affordability is not viable in this particular case. I'd also echo the fact that Councillor Shrewsbury sort of points out a concern which I have. If the calculations on the regulations or the legislation requires that for 211 flats, only 1 disabled space is all that's required, it seems somewhat disappointing of the developer to only go with the regulations to provide just one disabled space for 211 flats. But that said, that's what the rules are. That's what the rules are. The question which I'd like to ask, because it was related to disabled parking, is on the tree plan. Do we have a net loss or a net gain on the number of trees which will be removed for this application? And if so, what is that net loss or net gain?
Mr. Hubbard?
The number of trees, I think there is 40 trees to be removed, but these are sort of mostly of the lower quality category. There's a few B quality trees which are to be removed, but this is no different to the student scheme which was allowed last year. You can see the trees that are to be lost sort of outlined in the sort of brown dashed outline. You can see they're all on the same part of the site where the buildings are to go. In terms of those to be planted, there's not going to be a net gain in trees. No, we've got probably about half that amount going back.
Thank you, Mr. Hubbard.
If I may, Chair, is there any provision or any condition which could be put upon the developer, should it be granted, that for the net loss of the trees is that they're planted elsewhere within the conservation?
Mr. Cook?
Thank you, Chairman. It probably might have been a question actually that we could have asked Mr. Hubbard to clarify on. So the point that you're raising, Councillor, is that you want to see a net gain. Is that the point you're saying, or compensation replanting for the loss of the trees on the site?
Well, I think it's beholden upon developers, if they are actually going to remove trees, to actually replace them in today's society.
Yeah. Again, I might ask if Mr. Hubbard comes, so he'll know the conditions slightly better, but it's possible that there might be a condition already in the recommendation that seeks to deal with replanting. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Hubbard?
On the site itself, we've got the landscaping condition and the landscaping plan, which shows the trees which are to be planted. You can see there's there are one or two extra ones around the bottom of the site and the side of the site where there is space to do so. They are so, and they are also making a contribution towards sort of local biodiversity measures, which will be within the borough, and this is partly to offset that loss of trees and biodiversity. Let me just find the detail of that. Yeah, £10,500 local biodiversity contribution.
Thank you, Mr. Hubbard. Councillor Farquhar?
If I may, Chair, the reply there was partially offset. I think the point which I'm trying to make is that can it not be a condition that if we can't get a net gain, then at least we break even on the number of mature trees, no matter what their condition are, that are actually removed from the premises or from the application site.
It probably wouldn't be able to be put on there, Councillor Farquhar, because under the appeal inspector's response to the last one, he accepted the tree reports, and therefore we wouldn't be able to make any amendments to that made it worse than it was on the previous application.
So would it be possible to actually have an accurate figure for the number of trees, the net loss that we have?
It is in the papers. The amount of trees that are coming down is in the report. Councillor Piddevin.
Thank you, Chair. Again, two questions. Clearly, the bulk of the materials is brick of various colours and sorts, but there was reference to cladding. So one question is, how much of the surface is clad, and what sort of cladding? I hope the answer's a good one, a safe one. The other question is how many of the flats are adapted or usable by people with disabilities and mobility issues? For well, this is what I'm wondering. I mean, the numbers need to at least match. So, if not more than match, because you may have two in a flat who both need a disabled vehicle. So,
Mr. Hubbard?
They're my questions.
The reference to cladding is actually quite minor elements between the windows. It's just very small elements of the overall scheme, as you can see here. There isn't a significant amount of cladding. It's just to provide a bit of detail on the windows, really. Sorry, can you just repeat the second question about?
It's this regarding are there any of the flats that will be disabled access? Are they going to be of any specific size to accommodate disabled persons if necessary?
They're all accessible by lift. In terms of within the flats themselves, it's not something I'm aware of, I'm afraid. Presumably they would all meet the sort of required standards, sort of building regulations in that respect.
No, I'm not fully satisfied because I thought you had to have a minimum number or minimum percentage with things like wider doorways and that sort of thing, shelf heights, facilities, that sort of.
Mr. Gould?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, if I could maybe try and assist Councillor Pollard. I think what we've got to recognise here is that we're now looking at the Bournemouth local plan and not the Poole local plan, for example. So on the previous debate, on the previous application, there are specific policies within the Poole local plan.
I thought these were national standards.
No, there are policies in the Poole local plan, obviously, that talk about requiring a percentage of units in the development to be accessible, but there isn't a policy specifically in the core strategy for Bournemouth. But notwithstanding all of that, and I think this is the point that you're alluding to, building control standards would also come into play. And obviously, they part M, I think it used to be, it may have changed, I'm not a building control expert, but that would have required a certain percentage of units to be accessible in the sense for disabled people. And so that would still be in play.
So am I to understand from what you've said and what Mr. Hubbard has said that accessible just means you can get there, you don't have to climb stairs?
No, it's beyond that. It's also ensuring that the corridor widths obviously are a sufficient standard for, say, someone in a wheelchair, that there's access to, toilet facilities and, adequate turning area in those rooms. So it goes beyond that. It goes down to the actual sizes of the units, but it's not a policy specifically within the Bournemouth core strategy, but it would be picked up under building control as well.
Well, that still doesn't answer numbers. Are you saying every flat would be like that? Needs to be like that, or
no, not every flat, a percentage of.
Yeah, well, again, what is that percentage?
Well, I couldn't tell you that under the building regs, because obviously that, but I know from previous experience that the building regs would pick up and require a certain number of accessible units, invariably more towards the ground floor.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a number of points, please. The first one, when I looked at the application form, I couldn't see the name of the owner of the land, but it did reference the town hall address. So I don't need to know the name of the landowner, but I would like confirmation whether it belongs to the council or otherwise, if possible. There was a very strong letter from residents or a representative of the residents that lived in Ding Park Crescent regarding the right of light. I'm sure this will have been taken care of, but I'd just like confirmation that it has been addressed. Now, talking parking again, it's all about parking. It's kind of odd that under the previous approval, student accommodation effectively wouldn't have required any parking. And so with this new scheme, initially 104 parking spaces were going to be provided. And with the implementation of the new SPD, that parking is no longer required. And therefore, the extra floor that was going to be added to the Richmond Gardens car park is no longer required and is not part of the scheme. So where am I coming to on this? Well, the issue I have is about the reduction in the costs of building and whether there is any implication on the viability assessment resulting from the building cost, because the reduction in cost will be in the order of millions of pounds. It will not be insignificant, so I'd just like an answer for that. And just going on now to affordable housing, we under the last application we discussed, an overage clause. Now, because we have a different local plan to that of in Bournemouth to that in Poole, whilst the affordable housing supplementary parking documents are almost identical, there's one area that they differ, and that is in the provision of an overage clause against affordable housing. So I'd just like to ask the question, is it possible to apply the overage clause, as we did in the last application, to this one in respect of affordable housing, or can we not? So I just wanted a clarification of that. And I think, having said all of that, which sounds all a bit negative, I know, I have to say that I think this is a really good use of a very difficult site. It maximises the use in the town, and it should be welcomed. But I would like just clarification on those points of the phrase. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bartlett. Mr. Howard.
Okay. In terms of these, it is a privately owned site. It's split between two parties. I think one party owns the land around the car park and the other party owns the car park itself. And the car park is leased to the council on a long-term lease as a public car park. The viability has been assessed. It was originally assessed with the extra car park deck last year, and they have taken, it's correct, yes, they've taken the deck off because it was going to cost them about £2 million, I think. So they've taken that deck off because of the new parking SPD says they don't need to provide any parking. And I have gone back to the district valuer since then, at the beginning of this year, to check with them whether it would make any sort of significant change to the original viability assessment, but the answer was no, because it was originally so unviable with a sort of negative residual land value in the millions of pounds that even when you take off the car park cost, it still wasn't viable either as a build to rent scheme or a sale scheme. So ultimately, it hasn't had any impact in making it viable in that respect. And in terms of overage clause, it's not something I'm aware that we regularly use in Bournemouth area, but it seems like it's possible. But I'd have to seek sort of legal advice on that.
And with regards to the light issue for people in Dean Park Crescent, Mr. Hubbard?
So bear with me. Dean Park Crescent, was that the representation from the office blocks? I think that's probably referring to. We have had a daylight and sunlight assessment undertaken. It shows that there will be some shading to the office blocks, but it's not a significantly harmful impact. And it's generally a similar impact to earlier schemes that have been allowed on this site as well.
Councillor Bartley, did you want to come back?
Yeah, please. I think Dean Park Crescent did refer to a couple of, I think it was 4 residential properties, but you know, I accept the fact that that issue would have applied to the last scheme, which has been granted. So I guess it would already have been accommodated. I just wanted to make sure, because it was a particularly strong letter that was talking about various legal aspects of the right to light. But the thing I did actually forget to mention one other issue, and that was at the service road. There was quite a lot of numbered parking slots, and some of it serviced the commercial units on the other side. Now, I just wondered, and in fact, there's quite a number of them, and I'm just wondering, is the development going to affect those? Will those existing parking slots be retained in the service road area? Thank you.
Mr. Hubbard?
No, all of the parking on the service road is removed, and there was no highway objection to the loss of those spaces.
Okay.
That does give me some concern, Chair, because we heard about policy A19, which depicts a shortfall in parking, but that's not shortfall generated from anything to do with this development. It is the whole site in the area action plan. I believe it requires, I can't remember the figure, but when the car park was built, it didn't actually meet the requirement for the total number of car park spaces required in that area. And I think the shortfall currently is 50 odd. If we are now losing 20 or 30 additional parking slots that are located in that service road, that actually increases that shortfall. So we're losing existing car parking slots, which exacerbates that issue. Have you got any comment on that, please? Thank you.
Mr. Hubbard?
I don't have figures to hand, but I think that the multi-storey car park as it stands is underutilised. It's rarely full, so I think there is capacity to move those spaces into the main car park. I don't know if my highways colleagues have got any view on that.
Mr. Smith?
It's Mr. Edwards, actually. Mr. Smith had to leave.
Sorry, Mr. Edwards.
In terms of capacity of Richmond Gardens multi-storey car park, from memory, I believe it's operating at around something between 70 and 80% occupancy in peak period. Obviously, with major events, it gets closer to full occupancy.
And with regards to the parking spaces that are down the...
Yes, they would obviously have to be displaced into the car park, as there is no other available on-street area for them to park unless they go further away towards Richmond Hill.
Thank you.
So I think what we're saying then is, with the shortfall that has been identified, you then add those others, and I think they could be in the order of 40. We're actually looking at a shortfall of approaching 100 car parking spaces that should be accommodated on that site. Am I correct?
I'm not sure, to be honest, Councillor Bartlett, because I mean that car park's been there for many years. So I'm not sure if that shortfall wasn't accommodated in any of the other car parks around the town centre area.
No, that shortfall is identified in this report of around 50, and I think that did actually generate an objection initially from the highways team. What I'm suggesting now that shortfall will be increased because of a loss of these parking spaces in the service road, and that you know, that makes a substantial difference. I mean, if you're talking 100 parking slots or approaching that, it is significant.
Okay. Any comments, Mr. Gould?
Not at this stage. Obviously, we need to, well, not too much. We need to be mindful, obviously, of the appeal decision. You know, against the already the extant appeal decision on this site. So that is a material consideration. And again, to remind members that, you know, in their overall sort of weighing up, you know, we've got paragraph 11 of the NPPF, the framework, the presumption in favour of sustainable development. So, you know, it will be for members to decide how much they want to weigh any shortfall in parking against the other benefits. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Gould. Councillor Bartlett,
Yeah,
come back.
I'd just like to come back. I understand the issue about the existing consent, but of course that would have been based on student accommodation that would not have required parking allocation. And then, so this is different because it is residential accommodation.
But the parking SB shows that there's hardly any requirement for this development as well.
Understood, but the requirement is against the shortfall for the site, not specifically this development. And I mean, the report talks about the shortfall of 50 odd places. So I you know, I'm not going to die in a ditch in this because I understand the benefit of the development, but I just think that, you know, we are losing hundreds of car parking space provisions in the town centre, which is going to in the future make a lot of life very difficult. And with the best will in the world, you cannot assume that renters or owners of these apartments will not own cars. They will be displaced either onto highways or public car parking spaces. And at the end of the day, where will our visitors park and where will our residents park when they want to go to the town centre? We've already heard that this one in the summer is around 80% utilised, you know, and another 100 spaces in there, you know, it makes it full up during normal times. So, you know, as I say, I'm not going to die in a ditch about it, but it definitely is an issue that we really need to think about. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Bartlett. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I will be briefer on this one. I think that I feel the same as Councillor Bartlett on some of this. In regards to the light issue, I think that this proposal will be vastly superior to the extant scheme in that this has gaps between the blocks and it's not one large ringed development that rings all the way around with no gaps to allow any light through. In terms of the parking, I think that whilst it is clearly an issue, I think that the fact that we already stand to lose it as part of the extant scheme rather lessens its impact in my thinking on this one. And as such, I think that the benefits that are present in this scheme using this space in quite such a good manner is vastly important in the short term and the long term around our conurbation. So I would move to accept and grant as the report sets out, unless there are any further speakers, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Do you have a seconder for that move at this time? Councillor Stribley. Are you wishing to speak, please, Councillor Stribley?
Just briefly, Chairman. I don't have a real problem with this particular development, but a number of issues have been highlighted in the debate. And one of them in particular has been the difference between the pool local plan, and we finalised ours just before the merging of the authorities, and the current Bournemouth local plan, and presumably we're working towards a BCP local plan, which will give us consistency across the conurbation. And I think Councillor Farquhar there raised a very good issue, because we are all committed also to being a green council. So when there is an unavoidable loss of trees because of a development, as in this case overall, then there should be provision that the developer is expected to pay towards re-provision somewhere. Now here in this case it's about £10,500 towards ecological thing. The other difficulty may well be that we run out of council land on which we can put those replacement trees. but I do think it's something that needs to be looked at as a matter of principle in the next local plan. And I'm really sorry about the current SDP, which has virtually removed all parking in some areas, because that will certainly come back to haunt us. There are many places across the conurbation that were built in the 30s or before, and earlier, where very few people owned a car, so very few houses had a driveway that would accept a car, unless it was only about 5 foot wide, a little old Austin 7 or something. And in those areas, the streets are covered with people's cars because there's nowhere else to put them. But the streets are meant to be public highways, not private parking spaces. But you park outside somebody's house where they don't have much alternative, and you'll very quickly find out which it's considered to be. That's my parking space. I used to have an elderly friend who lived in a cottage, very short frontage, and she was incensed every time anybody parked outside, not because she didn't have a car, but because that was her space for her visitors to come and park in. And that is going to come back and haunt us, this lack of parking provision, because people will still have their own vehicles. They may be smaller, they may be mobility scooters, they may be little short cars, they may be different. And if in the future you find somehow suddenly nobody needs a car parking space, well, then you've got all that extra space that you can make environmentally friendly, turn it into a garden or build on if required.
Okay, can we stick to this planning application,
So
Councillor?
with this planning application, I'm happy to second.
Thank
Chair.
you. Councillor Bartlett.
Just I'd like to go back to the overage clause. Now, I'm not sure that we can condition that. I just would ask if officers can undertake to explore that issue.
I'll ask legal for their opinion, Councillor Bartlett. Mr. Firth.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. So funnily enough, I was just having a look to see what national guidance was on the subject, and not surprisingly, it does recognise that local plans particularly can identify when you can review plan policies, particularly when you're not going to meet the targets in the local plan. Absent that, and as far as I understand from what Mr. Hubbard said, there probably isn't anything specifically in a local plan on it. I'd say, well, there's nothing to stop members if they feel it's a material consideration in this particular case to try and negotiate an overage clause. I guess ultimately, if the developers resisted that, it'd be something that may have to come back to committee, and members may have to think about it again if that's what members wanted to do. But I guess in principle, I can't say it's not a planning consideration. It would be a planning consideration because it's not meeting your policy targets.
Thank you, Mr. Firth. In that case, I certainly agree, Councillor Bartlett. I'd like to see a condition put in for that on this one, if the mover and seconder are happy with that also. Yeah. So, Mr. Hubbard, if you could word up a condition on that, it would be very helpful. Thank you.
It'd be a 106. Probably a planning obligation, Chairman.
Okay, that's fine. We'll stick it in at 106. You happy with that, Councillor Bartlett? Yep. Thank you. So moving on, it's a strange application, isn't it? Because we do have this, what I class as an Eastern Bloc looking building when they went for their student accommodation, which was no gaps between. It wasn't very aesthetically nice and pleasing, whereas this one does look a lot better than that. And on balance, I think I'd rather have this amount of residential rather than 600 students. No disrespect to students, but I think we probably have as much student accommodation in big blocks as we really need right at this moment, bearing in mind everything that's going on around us as we live today. So I welcome the extra residential and the fact that it takes a chunk out of our housing needs as well. And again, keeps us from nudging towards that greenbelt line, doesn't it, by doing these things. I think Councillor Farquhar made a good point about the trees, and I'm glad to see that they are going to give us 10.5 grand to help mitigate and plant trees in other areas. We can't always have them in the same place as developments, and I have found over the years that sometimes having loads of trees actually makes the development non-sustainable, because you end up having your lights on all day long because they're blocking out the light, which sort of defeats the whole object at the end of the day, because you end up using more electricity. which is what we've been trying to avoid. So having them sometimes planted elsewhere can't be all such a bad thing. So I will support this application. I think it's much better than the two previous schemes that we've had in on this one. So we have a move by Councillor Stribley, seconded by Councillor Johnson. Once again,
The other way around.
sorry, moved by Councillor Johnson, seconded by Councillor Stribley. I apologise. And I will again call your names in turn. If we could indicate for, against or abstention, please. I'll start with myself as chair. Councillor Kelsey, I am for the application. And Councillor Johnson as vice chair? For. And Councillor McCormick? For. Councillor Steve Barron? For. And Councillor Steve Bartlett? For. Councillor Simon Bull? For. Councillor Malcolm Davies? For. Councillor Brian Dion? For. And Councillor George Farquhar? For. Councillor Peter Hall? For. Councillor Paul Hilliard? For. Councillor Marion Lepedovin?
For.
Councillor Tony O'Neill? For. And Councillor Anne Stribley?
For.
I make it that is unanimous, so therefore that application is granted with the added part for the 106 to look at an outage clause and that. Thank you very much, Mr. Hubbard, for your time this afternoon and an excellent report again, an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
With that in line, members, thank you very much for your attendance this afternoon, and I'll call the meeting to the end, and I'll ask Max to stop the public screaming, please, Max.